Welcome back to this briefing on the global economy as part of Asia Briefing Live. I'm Stephanie Flanders, head of Bloomberg Economics and senior executive editor for economics here at Bloomberg. It feels like a very good time to be thinking about the path of the global recovery. It's a matter of weeks almost. It certainly feels like not very long ago that we were worried about lack of demand, as we moved out of the pandemic, hopefully moving to an endemic stage of COVID. And yet, certainly in large parts of the world, we're now very focused on lack of supply and the inflation that might result from that, and the kind of challenges for policymakers that might arise from those conflicting objectives and developments in the global economy. So I'm delighted that we have such a good panel to talk about these things. And for me personally, to get a perspective on how the recovery is being seen in this region, because there are certainly some specific challenges which perhaps we're not hearing enough about in the US and Europe as we obsess about our particular stage of our recovery. So I'm delighted to be here. Joining me for this 45 minutes conversation will be Xiaolin Chai, Director of Trade and Services and Investment Division of the World Trade Organization, Vera Chaplin, who's Managing Director and the Lead Analytical Manager for S&P Global Ratings, Bruce Gosper, Vice President of the Asian Development Bank, and Mathias Cormann, Secretary General of the OECD, we're delighted is going to be able to talk to us on a pre-recorded basis from the OECD. So why don't we get started with a polling question? I think by now you've learnt how to do the questions for this live briefing, but if you could go back to those questions and answer this: what is the biggest threat to the global economic recovery in your view right now? Is it A, US-China decoupling, something we've certainly thought a lot about over the last few years? B, supply chain disruptions, very evident right now, for sure, in many parts of the world. C, new COVID variants. D, central bank tapering, or central banks starting to remove the exceptional support they've given to the global economy. And E, climate change. So that's US-China decoupling, supply chain disruptions, new COVID variants, central bank tapering, and climate change. Which are you most concerned about when you think about the path of the global recovery? And I think we'll wait for a little while to get answers on that. Now that's we've got people deciding. There's quite a few. It feels like there's quite a few threats to choose from these days. But it's interesting that the US-China decoupling, which in a few senses has been less talked about in recent months, is clearly something that people in this region are recognizing the long-term implications of that for all their economies. So I think that's pretty interesting. We're still seeing US-China decoupling and new COVID variants, at least in the view of this audience, very scientific, as the key threat to the global economy. Right, so we have a brief pre-recorded contribution now from Mathias Cormann, which I mentioned, the Secretary General of OECD. So let's run that now.
Thank you for inviting me to attend today's Asia Briefing live forum. Global economic growth has picked up this year, backed by strong fiscal and monetary support, the ongoing vaccination rollout, and the gradual resumption of economic activities. Indeed, the OECD's latest forecasts project global GDP growth to reach 5.7% this year and 4.5% next year. While the economic outlook is also improving in the Asia-Pacific, indeed, the OECD projects growth of 7.4% across ASEAN, China and India in 2021. Vaccination has been lagging in some areas, and growth prospects are hampered by restrictions and disruptions to trade and mobility. Such developments risk causing longer-term scarring for workers and companies. So the theme of this year's forum, Rethink, Recovery and Renewal, is fully aligned with the OECD's approach. The world was already facing a series of structural challenges before the pandemic hit: sluggish productivity growth, how to ensure the world can get to global net zero by 2050 in an appropriately globally coordinated way, how to better manage the risks and challenges associated with the accelerating digital transformation of our economies while optimizing its benefits, how to ensure well-functioning global markets underpinned by a rules-based global trading system in good working order. While there's no one-size-fits-all strategy, the OECD's policy advice focuses on 4 overarching themes. First, building resilience to shocks and strengthening environmental sustainability. This means improving the coverage of our healthcare and social systems, reducing pressures on the environment, and taking ambitious and effective action on climate change. Though climate policies alone will not be enough to support the transition, structural and fiscal policy reform will need to reduce and address the costs of the transition and improve opportunities for businesses to contribute to achieving climate change mitigation goals. This brings me to the second theme, removing impediments to the reallocation of capital and labour, helping to boost productivity growth. We need to let markets reward the most productive, most innovative businesses. It requires fostering fair competition, a strong rule of law, and crucially, robust rules-based trade. Many Asian countries perform very well in the OECD's trade facilitation indicators, which measure countries' streamlining of border-crossing processes for internationally traded goods. This streamlining became crucial during the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries in East Asia, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia responded to the global demand boom for electronics by increasing their exports by 8.4% and 8.1% respectively in 2020. China also grew its exports of electronics by 2.4%. In other areas, such as services trade, room for improvement remains. The digital transformation of our economies was well underway before COVID-19 hit us, but the pandemic has further significantly accelerated it all around the world. That digital transformation brings many obvious benefits and opportunities, but it also comes with new evolving challenges, risks and disruptions. As policymakers, we need to ensure we maximise the benefits while better managing some of those associated challenges, risks and disruptions. The final theme for us focuses on supporting people in these transitions. While some sectors will recover quickly, others may never regain their pre-pandemic size and new specialisations will emerge. Reskilling, upskilling, skills matching is crucial to empower workers and ensure everyone has the best possible opportunity to participate and benefit in our societies and in our economies. For those who cannot work, either because of caring responsibilities, there should be a strong social safety net. Policies will need to try and minimise scarring from COVID-19 and future shocks and help workers make the most out of the opportunities of a dynamic economy. These themes centred around resilience, a reallocation, the sustainable expansion of global trade in an increasingly digitalised world, and support in transitions are the foundations of the OECD's recommendation for each economy. Colleagues, the only way we can optimise both the strength and the quality of the recovery in the wake of COVID, as well as solve our more long-standing shared challenges, is by working together. You can count on the OECD to continue to work with you and for you to help solve these challenges together. I wish you all a productive discussion. Thank you.
Well, that was a fantastic way to kick us off. I should say that we're having a little problem with Vera Chaplin's sound connection, and I thought it would be a bit frustrating for her to be just listening and not able to contribute herself. So we're just going to be fixing that while we move ahead with the discussion with the other speakers, Xiaolin and Bruce. Bruce Gosper, we heard a bit there from the head of the OECD about some of the challenges for the recovery and the importance of bringing everyone along. If you look across Asia specifically, how would you say at this stage of recovery that the region is doing, and what are the key pitfalls that you see potentially kind of bumps in the road over the next year or so?
Thanks, Stephanie, and it's great to join you here today for this discussion. And it's a good way to start off our discussion, because here at the Asian Development Bank, when we look across the region, we're particularly conscious of really the path forward and the very differing paths that individual developing member economies face at the moment. So Australia seems to have weathered things relatively well, but if you look across the region, there's relatively good news, but some bad news and some worse news, I'd put it that way. I mean, the good news is that in some senses the recovery is underway, that many economies are growing, and certainly trade continues its rebound with reasonable growth rates in the PRC, and more particularly in developing Asia, good growth rates. Now that of course has been affected by second and third waves of the pandemic and the relatively slow rate of vaccine rollout across the region, 41.6 doses per 100 people, so less than half that applies in North America or Europe. So that's definitely affecting the environment. But I heard the OECD's forecast, as Mathias Cormann set out, is some 7.4%. We're a little bit more sober when we look at developing Asia, or something like 7.1% looking ahead. And in Southeast Asia, probably about 5.2% from the 4% we expect this year. So in that sense, I think, for an Australian audience looking at the region, the big story that we've seen in the last couple of decades about this region, its growth, its potential, the middle class emerging, its demand for food and energy, for skills, for leisure opportunities, those sorts of things, that's still all there. But the impacts vary substantially across the region. If we look at some of the small island states or the more fragile states, GDP per capita is below where it was pre-pandemic. We're seeing unemployment in around about a third of the economies, that's some 20% higher than it was before. We're certainly seeing micro, small and medium-sized economies badly affected. And poverty reduction has been stalled, more or less stalled across the region. And then what's worse, there are some significant setbacks if we look at it, certainly on issues like climate, environmental degradation, resource stresses, that's all worse. Technology gaps have been exacerbated, but big problems around schooling, around learning and what eventually will be earning, of course, for the region, and big consequences for gender, for the way women in the region face it. So I think we sort of see a region that continues to be of continuing promise, but very uneven, some significant problems that the pandemic has brought, and a fraught environment in the sense that the pandemic has, in a sense, compressed many problems, and the complex problems that the region faces are becoming more urgent.
Well, thanks, Bruce. That was a fantastic overview. I think it would be helpful. I think it's also good to have some of those sobering notes about the long-term impact, but potentially the need for governments to be responding to those long-term impacts right now as we see the path of the recovery. Well, I'm glad to say that Vera has been able to join us now. Vera, just I don't know how much you could hear of Bruce's magisterial overview of the impact of different parts of the region of COVID. I think one specific issue that he raised is this unequal impacts and how that may have set back some of the region's development. We'd sort of assume this was going to be the Asian century. Is there a serious dent to that now coming from COVID?
So that's a fairly big question, Stephanie. So In terms of Asian century, I think it's a multi-decade effort and much more to go. And if we look globally, yes, actually the recovery is on its way. And despite the emerging markets are lagging due to, I guess, the vaccine being rolling out slowly, we do have I guess, a view that, or forecasting that it is going to go back on track at some stage. So COVID is not the one that is going to create a huge setback on Asia century or terminate it, as some would say it. But more importantly, I think we need to shift our focus onto China in terms of its stance in terms of economic growth, and looking at China. It's actually, in terms our economists and analysts are closely following its recent policy stance, its rhetoric in terms of shifting away of its focus from economic growth to actually looking more closely at other policy agendas. So a plethora of all the new policies that's curbing the tech, the property sector, etc., are aligned with its policy interests in terms of, and the principles with common prosperity. So that's probably a space we should be watching closely. So Asian century is still here, but perhaps with a slower growth with China, focusing on restoring quality of growth and curbing debt.
Well, thank you for that. I think that's another big piece, and I had certainly had on my list China. We must talk about China, and so there's that I think we should come back to, because if we are seeing and I think we are, this significant shift in the overall development strategy of China, or they would say they've been following it all along, but moving to a new stage, I think that could have some pretty important implications for the global economy, let alone the region. But just to turn to you, Xiaolin, with your WTO perspective, we had much focus early on in the pandemic about what the experience of the pandemic was going to do to globalization. Would we see regionalization? Would we see dismantling of supply chains that have been relying heavily, particularly on China, but other producing manufacturing economies in the region? A year and a half on, how is that looking? Do you think there is when we look in the long term, will we see a reversal or a serious change in the path of globalization, an increase in protectionism, perhaps as a result of COVID?
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your question. Yes, indeed. And I think COVID shock has brought unprecedented disruptions to us all. And every time when the crisis strikes and the voice of either deglobalization or decoupling becomes louder. But after doing a reality check, as you said, after a year and a half, I would like, if I may, to offer a slightly different perspective. And the WTO statistics and the monitoring report show that instead of a projected 30% drop, the actual drop in goods trade was a little over 5% for 2020. It is true that the supply chains are under stress, and there are problems such as semiconductor scarcity and the port backlogs, but there was no a total breakdown of supply chains, and the supply bottlenecks are more related to a mismatch of supply and demand due to strong rebound in global trade and a surge in demand for consumer durable goods. And our statistics also show that services trade was hit the hardest, such as sectors related to travel and leisure, but business, financial, and telecom services witnessed a phenomenal growth, about 66% in the first half of 2021 compared to the previous year due to their ability to go online. So since the pandemic, and we also have done some monitoring exercise, and we found that COVID-related trade facilitating measures that cover goods trade in worth $227 billion, while the so-called restrictive measures covers about $180 billion. And out of these 180 billion restrictive measures, 39% were already repealed by mid-October last year. So I just wanted to say that, to go back to your question, and I think in a hyper-connected world enabled by digital technology, where manufacturing vaccines would require inputs of 280 components sourced from 19 different countries, a going inward and protectionist mentality and pursuit will not fly. So I'm remaining hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Xiaolin. I'm interested, Bruce, from an economist standpoint, when you look at the supply chain disruptions that we're seeing, there's a view that says that this is entirely temporary, and we, as Xiaolin said, it's a disconnect in the timings between demand and supply. Demand, we can all sort of try to restart our normal lives much faster than the real economy can restart normal production. But another view says that we may end up with businesses taking a different approach and wanting to have much more resilient supply chains. So I just wonder, are you as confident as Xiaolin that this is we're going to be back to the same old patterns of globalization afterwards?
Well, I think I agree with Xiaolin that if you look at those trade exposed parts of the economies and those who are integrated in supply chains have managed reasonably well. Although there have been disruptions, there have certainly been bottlenecks of one sort or another. There have been supply constraints, and increasingly I suspect there are skill gaps, particularly as supply chains shift to the region, and some of the challenges of managing production and trade become a little bit more complex, particularly in the geopolitical environment and with pandemic-induced bottlenecks and constraints on mobility of people and on networks of one sort or another. So I think those things are there, but perhaps not as pronounced as we might have expected 12 months ago or longer ago. So there are big shifts underway, but the big story, I think, about strong interregional trade, particularly in Southeast Asia, is still there. Investment, although disrupted early on in areas like automobiles and electronics was disrupted, investment is resuming, and certainly the integration of this part of the world with the Atlantic economies and with China is still very much there.
And Vera, I want to come back to you on what you said about China, because certainly when we're thinking about this, I'm lucky enough to have a team of 30 economists and about 100 economic reporters around the world thinking about economics for Bloomberg. And one of the things that we've been trying to kind of grapple with is the long-term impact of this shift of direction by the Chinese on global demand. And I guess one potential fear out of some of the things that we're seeing and the change of priorities of the authorities is that instead of, if you like, exporting excess supply and deflationary pressure to the rest of the world, we're going to move to a stage where China's actually contributing to inflationary pressures and actually taking supply out of the economy, the global economy. So I just wondered how you see the change in the slowdown of China's growth path, the change in the composition of growth affecting the global economy and the regional economy?
So, you know, it's sort of it's a long story to look at, but we're still thinking that the slowdown will have spillover effect to regional and global economy. And having said that, as mentioned, the policy stance is reprioritizing and looking at social technology, financial stability, environmental related goals. However, I think China is looking at dual circulation. The fact that it's striving to be more self-reliant does not mean it's cutting itself completely off with the rest of the world. It's probably more hedging itself in terms of growing some of the domestic reliance on domestic demand, and also have some independence on areas where they are more vulnerable and exposed potentially. And we expect our economists actually did a study called the inevitable slowdown. So we expect China's average growth to slow to about 4.6% between 2021 and an average of 4.6 to 2021 and 2030. So, I think overall this slowing is going to have an impact, given its significant size in its contribution to the the world economic growth. So, but it's not about completely cutting itself off. It's about how to work as a multipolar world where each bring their strength, I guess.
And Xiaolin, one of the key ways that we continue the cooperation and spread shared strategies around policy has obviously always been through institutions like the WTO, but also the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. I wonder whether you feel that those institutions collectively kind of measured up and fulfilled their proper role in response to the pandemic.
Thank you very much for the question, and I will make a couple of points. First, that WTO was quick in action, and its principles and rules seems to me that it helped to prevent the world from sliding into a full-fledged protectionism. And for example, at the very beginning of the pandemic, the G20 members agreed that emergency measures designed to tackle COVID-19, if deemed necessary, must be targeted, proportionate, and transparent and temporary, and do not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to global supply chains, and should be consistent with the WTO rules. And for WTO, WTO quickly forged partnership with other international organizations, namely FAO, WHO, the World Customers Organization, the World Bank, and the WIPO, and also with the International Chamber of Commerce to try to keep trade open and supply chains functional. Currently, WTO members has launched a trade and health initiative to ensure universal equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, to remove export restrictions, and work on practical solutions to intellectual property protection. So I think during the pandemic and also looking ahead to the post-pandemic recovery, and I think WTO and other international organizations would continue to play a role. And also the role of these institutions, including WTO, has been clearly welcomed and recognized in the statements such as the G7 and G20 and APEC statements. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiaolin. Bruce, I wanted to, one of the things obviously that the international institutions are focused on is the sort of the inequality that may have resulted from this pandemic, and you were pretty sobering on that in your first comments. So I'm just wondering, we have a lot of talk about better, but it seems to me, looking at many countries, we're a struggle just to get back where we were in terms of inequalities, let alone offsetting them.
Yeah, and unfortunately that's true. So from an Asian Development Bank perspective, and remember we're an institution that's in the region, we're in a developing economy and we look after the developing economy. So we see the full gamut of consequences, and it's, as I said, poverty reduction's been set back in many places. Bear in mind that we're looking at more than the trade exposed sectors and those who are in the most advanced parts of economies now, and the reality is that 2/3 of workers are in the informal sector. So if you look at what's happening, there is a new poor that's emerging, mostly in urban areas, because the agriculture sector has fared relatively better in response to the pandemic. But there is a new poor, migrant workers, the young, the very elderly, but in particular women. More women are in informal work than men. They've suffered from schooling, they've suffered from there's much more gender-based violence and discrimination of those sorts that's emerged in recent times. And these workers, 2/3 of all workers, they have very few social protections. So we're finding in the work we do that being able to help quite stressed small governments manage increased social protections and these marginalized workers who have seen their lives significantly disrupted is a very significant challenge.
I should encourage everyone to put in their questions, although we're going to have just a few minutes for that. Vera, do you think that when you look at the sort of global economic impact of this and the sort of rising inequalities that we've seen in some places, we certainly see what Bruce mentioned is true across US and Europe as well, that it's the service sector workers in cities that have obviously been most affected, even as others are sort of taking the advantage of working from home and maybe not coming into the centre as much. How do you see the long-term effects for productivity and for those less protected parts of the population? Oh, we're not hearing. I think are you on mute or?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You haven't lost me. Thank goodness this time. No, yeah, I think I have to agree with Bruce. Just in terms of the informal sectors, and there might be disruption where their skill gaps may emerge. Having said that, there's been acceleration with adoption of technology and new way of working. So there will be investment required in closing the skills gap to bring that equality closer. I think what's more important also is that the governments, I think we need to acknowledge that the central governments have really deployed massive policies trying to bridge the gap and stop that or minimize the damage to the structural changes. And absent that, with a downturn of this size, I think we would have seen a much worse outcome. So the outcome has been somewhat cushioned, and a lot of, especially advanced economies, have deployed, have better fiscal position to actually deploy the measures to support businesses, households, and job markets. Emerging markets, of course, have less fiscal room. This is where some of the gaps is going to be created, also not just within like country, but across region. There's also higher borrowing in the foreign currency, And so overall, in future, we've got to watch how they rebalance this and how to actually invest into future, not just in the physical investment, but also the human capital investment.
Just to come back to you briefly on that, I'm just wondering, we clearly, the other side of all this fiscal action is debt. And we often sort of sow the seeds of the next crisis with the response to this one. It's been such an exceptional fiscal response in some economies. And then, as you say, others have been held back by not having that fiscal space. With your sort of S&P hat on, is a sovereign debt issue something that you see coming down the track?
Yeah, so look, the debt is certainly growing. And having said that, I think post-GFC, with a lower for longer and investor appetite for, for higher yield, that debt level have already been growing. Certainly COVID propelled to have more spending, and rightly so. The government have spent more money and taking on more debt, many at record levels. But it's, I guess, all this after a bit of assessment, our analysts actually did some pretty deep dive. If you look at the global debt levels, we are estimating that it's going to be about around 260% at the end of 2021. This higher leverage, certainly combined with the weakened credit metrics, likely to see more defaults. Having said that, we are looking at a lower interest rate environment, so the ability to service them is also, I guess, manageable. And our analysts actually have done some study of how sovereign can actually withstand the future increase in interest rates. So globally, the study we've done is to stress by increasing 300 basis points in servicing, in servicing cost interest rate. And, as we see across, the sovereigns actually do have room to absorb that, of course, with, the ones that are struggling most at the bottom tier. And we're also sort of seeing that COVID is not over. The recovery is not complete until we get on top of the vaccine and have people feel more comfortable moving back to living with COVID. So putting that context, our analysts actually have done further stress study by assuming that we have further major shutdowns across APEC region, and that it's necessary for government to actually incur further support, however, probably more targeted support to sustain. And with this study, we also come out to see that most of them are actually able to absorb this additional debt. However, what it has done is to, as I mentioned before, constrain its ability for future investment and future ability to withstand the shock. So the credit metrics certainly will be weakening from that perspective.
And we're just about going to be running out of time, but we have time for a little bit more. And Xiaolin, I just wanted to come back to you. You mentioned climate change. And actually, it's one of the things increasingly we're seeing in people when they're talking about sovereign ratings. There's also an element of thinking about the long-term impact of climate change on the sovereign creditworthiness. But if we do want to build back better and respond to some of the challenges that Bruce and Vera have highlighted, and specifically to be trying to build in zero carbon promises and other climate commitments into that growth strategy, what is the role of the WTO and international institutions in that? What's the most important thing that they can do to help?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I quite agree with Bruce and Vera about the uncertainties that the pandemic is still bringing to the world. Coming to how the WTO would play a role in terms of environmental sustainability and fighting against climate change. And I just wanted to share some latest movements or the actions taken by the WTO members. And environmental goods and services negotiations has been with WTO for many years. And with the renewed the attention to climate change, and also because the WTO had also 2 years ago have identified 4 trends that will shape the future trade and the future economy, and including the climate change. So therefore, the WTO members right now are accelerating their actions, and they started the structured dialogue on trade and environmental sustainability, and covers the 2 components I've just mentioned. It's the environmental goods agreement negotiation, and start to explore the market access issues relates to some sectors, services sectors relates to environmental protection. And also they have launched an initiative on trade and plastics, and also they are working on the issues about the carbon adjustment, border adjustments, and also the taxation issues that is being explored by OECD. So I think the environmental issues is part of trade issues, and so WTO certainly has a role to play, and also has a role to be partner with international organizations, and also contribute to the deliberations and discussions, for example, in OECD, in World Bank, in other United Nations environmental program. So I see a joint efforts, and as the world is going more greener and digital, and certainly the trade negotiations in terms of liberalization and also regulatory cohesion and coordination would be the key. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be very bad now. We're pretty much out of time. So I wanted to ask Bruce and Vera to give a short answer to an incredibly big question. So forgive me, but we're thinking at Bloomberg about the long-term impact of the pandemic on growth, on the long-term level of the global economy. We saw with the global financial crisis an almost unprecedented long-term hit to the level of GDP. We took a chunk out of the global economy with that recession that we never really got back. There is a feeling in the US and parts of Europe that actually this crisis will be different because of the response, that you're actually going to see very little or even no permanent hit from this crisis because the response was so big and so swift. But that's not the case, clearly, for many emerging market economies. When you look at this region, what do you see a big permanent hit, or actually that we may in a few years' time feel like we have weathered this and we did the right things and we have no missing bit of our global economy as a result of the local recovery? Bruce.
Yeah, so you've given me half an hour, is that right, to answer this?
half a minute, right?
Yeah, look, the medium to longer term growth profile for the region, I think, is there. But what we've seen, courtesy of the pandemic, is an acceleration of a whole lot of challenges, and in a way they've become compressed, and that's putting a lot of stress on governments which are battling with just basic growth and well-being for its population. So, I'm talking about things like gender, about climate, about digitalization, all those sorts of things. So, in fact, we're talking about big cohorts of people whose future is not assured, unless they've got the right partners, Australia, the international institutions, people like ADB, that offer innovative solutions to these problems, quite complex problems in relatively short timeframes. Otherwise, we are looking at a severely lesser growth profile for the region, I fear.
Thank you, Bruce. Vera.
So just adding to that, I guess we've already seen a 1.5% contraction in Asia Pacific's economy in 2020, and if you take China out of there, that is greater than 5%. And our economists released reports last week and estimating close to 5% permanent output loss. So having said that, we do think that while there is going to be a permanent gap, it will, within a couple of 2 to 3 years' time, starting to follow the trend of the past growth. So it's still unclear whether there is actually structural damage at this point. Our base case is we don't see any major structural damage. We saw, of course, structural job losses that could require investment in reinvestment. And as everyone else have also mentioned, there's investment and refocus into the greener climate change, energy transition. So for the emerging market, I think we're going to see that some of the recovery and ability to do this somewhat delayed. And the big economies will emerge, when in the green growth, green finance and sustainability space, Europe is leading the path. And in innovation, cutting edge technology, US is still leading. And then, of course, China infrastructure build out, public led investment. So I think on the back of some of these major trends, the emerging market will find their way to actually grow with the global momentum.
Well, as we heard right at the start, this audience is particularly focused on that US-China relations and how that will affect the regional recovery. Well, thank you so much to all of you, Xiaolin Cai, Vera Chaplin and Bruce Gosper. This has been a great discussion, and I hope everyone listening has got as much out of it as I have. But thank you so much.